Hash 10 ways Battlestar Galactica changed Star Trek's sci-fi formula. When the reimagined Battlestar Galactica BSG hit the airwaves in 2004, it didn't just reboot a campy 1970s space opera. It fundamentally altered the trajectory of televised science fiction. While Star Trek had long been the gold standard of thoughtful, hopeful, and structured sci-fi, BSG brought grit, chaos, and human frailty to the forefront. Its influence was seismic, especially on Star Trek itself. As Star Trek re-entered the modern television landscape with series like Discovery, Picard, and Strange New Worlds, the fingerprints of BSG were all over the warp core. Here are 10 ways Battlestar Galactica changed Star Trek's sci-fi formula forever. 1. Dark, gritty realism replaced idealism. Star Trek had always envisioned a utopian future where humanity had evolved past greed, racism, and war. But Battlestar Galactica asked the harder question: what if survival made utopia impossible? It portrayed a post-apocalyptic human race clinging to its morals while being hunted to extinction. The show was soaked in ambiguity and moral compromise. This gritty realism influenced Star Trek, Discovery in particular. The show abandoned the pristine perfection of the next generation and embraced a more chaotic federation, plagued by war, espionage, and trauma. Characters like Lorca and Burnham weren't morally spotless. They made hard choices in dark times, just like BSG's Adama or Roslin. 2. Serialized storytelling over episodic adventures. For decades, Star Trek episodes functioned as standalone morality plays. While there were arcs, they rarely dominated the narrative. Battlestar Galactica, however, was a serial odyssey. Each episode fed into a larger, evolving plot. Cliffhangers and long-term consequences became standard. Star Trek caught on. Star Trek, Picard, and Discovery are almost entirely serialized, with single narratives stretching across seasons. The Alien of the Week formula gave way to arcs about existential threats, political intrigue, and personal redemption, exactly what BSG had mastered. 3. Flawed commanders and morally gray leadership. Captain Picard and Captain Janeway were paragons of leadership, calm, ethical, and wise. In contrast, BSG's Admiral Adama was gruff, secretive, and sometimes dangerously emotional. President Roslin wielded power like a dagger in the shadows. These leaders were deeply flawed and deeply human. This shift in leadership depiction filtered into Star Trek. Lorca in Discovery was a dark mirror of leadership, and even Captain Pike in Strange New Worlds, while more traditional, is portrayed with a looming awareness of his own mortality and flaws. Leadership in Star Trek became less about virtue and more about complexity, a very BSG-esque evolution. 4. Religion and spirituality as core themes. Star Trek generally eschewed religion, preferring rationalism and science. Battlestar Galactica flipped that, making religion, and especially polytheism versus monotheism, a central thematic engine. Prophecies, visions, and questions of faith were treated as serious, universe-altering forces. In Star Trek Discovery, the concept of the Red Angel, time travel, and the Vulcan belief systems took on more spiritual tones. Even Picard explored synthetic consciousness in ways that brushed against the divine. Faith, destiny, and metaphysical pondering, one side notes, began taking center stage thanks to BSG's bold precedent. 5. Post-traumatic stress as a sci-fi reality. Characters in Star Trek rarely showed long-term psychological effects from their experiences. Trauma was reset by the next episode. Battlestar Galactica broke that model. Characters like Starbuck, Ty, and Hilo carried their psychological wounds throughout the series. Trauma was enduring and shaped choices. Modern Trek embraced this change. Michael Burnham is deeply marked by her actions. Picard struggles with his own legacy and trauma from his bored past. PTSD became part of the narrative fabric, making characters feel more real, fallible, and relatable, all thanks to BSG's emotional daring. 6. Cinematic production and documentary aesthetic. BSG changed how sci-fi looked. Gone were the polished starship interiors and theatrical lighting. In came handheld cameras, jump cuts, and a pseudo-documentary aesthetic that made space battles feel visceral and grounded. This raw, immersive look set a new standard. Star Trek followed suit. Discovery adopted a darker, more cinematic palette, and Picard often used more handheld shots and realistic lighting. The sleek, idealized Federation gave way to a universe that felt lived in, imperfect, and believable. Visual storytelling evolved because of BSG. 7. The enemy within. In Star Trek, alien threats were usually external: Klingons, Borg, Romulans. BSG introduced the terrifying idea that the enemy could be anyone, even someone you love. The humanoid Cylons looked just like humans and could infiltrate the fleet undetected. This idea echoed through Star Trek later. Section 31 became a more central, menacing force in Discovery. In Picard, synths posed existential dilemmas. Trust, once assumed among Starfleet, became something characters had to earn or question. Paranoia and suspicion, hallmarks of BSG, crept into Trek. 8. Moral ambiguity over clear-cut ethics. Classic Star Trek prided itself on moral clarity. Right was right. Wrong was wrong. But BSG relished moral ambiguity. Characters made impossible choices, sometimes sacrificing innocence or defying orders to protect ideals. The line between good and evil blurred. This deeply influenced Trek. Burnham's mutiny in Discovery is the pilot's core act. Picard defies Starfleet. Captains lie, rebel, and compromise. The Prime Directive, once sacred, is now contextually interpreted. Sci-Fi's ethical playbook was rewritten in shades of gray, BSG's specialty. 9. Endgame storytelling in a television landscape. BSG wasn't just a journey, it was a story with an ending. Its mythology, characters, and plot lines built toward a conclusion. It was finite and intentional. Modern Trek shows now follow this principle. Picard was designed as a 3-season arc. Discovery is ending with Season 5. The notion of telling a self-contained story, rather than running endlessly, marks a shift in Trek's storytelling ethos. BSG showed that sci-fi with a planned ending could have greater emotional payoff. 10. The collapse of civilization as sci-fi premise. Star Trek was built on the assumption of a functioning Federation. Even when threatened, it endured. But BSG began in the ashes of humanity, with 99% of the population dead and civilization gone. The story wasn't about thriving, it was about surviving. This idea filtered into Star Trek most powerfully in Discovery Season 3, when the crew travels to a future where the Federation has collapsed after the burn. This post-apocalyptic Trek embraced BSG's core conceit, rebuilding hope in the ruins. That would have been unthinkable for Trek pre-2004. Conclusion: Battlestar Galactica made Star Trek grow up. Battlestar Galactica didn't replace Star Trek, it challenged it. It asked harder questions, showed uglier truths, and demanded more of its characters. It cracked the utopian sheen and forced sci-fi to examine not what we could become, but what we are. When Star Trek returned in the streaming era, it didn't pretend BSG hadn't happened. Instead, it absorbed the lessons, recalibrated, and evolved. Star Trek still clings to its hope, but now that hope shines through gritted teeth and battle scars. That's the BSG legacy, a sci-fi revolution that reshaped Star Trek's formula without ever firing a shot across its bow.